Welcome back, everyone. Of course, you're participating in the 4th annual regional conference here for the GPA Midstream Association Appalachian Basin. This is the 3rd session, and we have Kathryn Klaber from the Klaber Group. Who's going to talk about perspectives on the past, present, and future of the natural gas industry. Welcome, Katie. Katie leads the Klaber Group, of course, providing strategic services to businesses and other institutions as they capitalize on shale development in the United States and abroad. Katie's career-long experience in energy, economic, and environmental issues at the confluence of the private and public sectors brings new perspectives, strategies, and implementation to the clients of the Klaber Group. She has launched and led the Marcellus Shale Coalition as its first CEO, growing it to be the premier regional trade association for the oil and gas industry in northeastern United States during a high-stakes period. Katie is also a regular speaker on energy issues to major audiences and has been a featured expert on national, state, and local media such as Fox Business, New York Times, Wall Street Journal, and Washington Post, and writes a monthly column for the Pittsburgh Business Times. Prior to joining the MSC, Ms. Klaber served as the Executive Vice President for Competitiveness at the Allegheny Conference on Community Development and Executive Director of the Pennsylvania Economy League. In these roles, she testified before state and federal agencies and legislative bodies on key policy issues and achieved significant regulatory and legislative outcomes. During the first decade of her career, Katie worked for the international environmental health and safety consulting firm, Environmental Resources Management, bringing her clients reliable compliance strategies and innovative business solutions. Katie earned her undergraduate degree in environmental science from Bucknell University and her master's in business administration from Carnegie Mellon, where she received the Enterprise Award for Entrepreneurship. She serves on the Cleveland Federal Reserve's Pittsburgh Board, the University of Pittsburgh School of Law's Energy and Law and Policy Institute, and Executive Committee of Junior Achievement of Western Pennsylvania. So welcome, Katie. Thank you for joining us today, and we look forward to your presentation.
Thank you very much. I understand that I will be sharing my screen here to walk through a PowerPoint along with my comments.
Yes.
Okay.
Let us know if you can do that.
Are you good there?
Not yet. If you have dual monitors, you might have to just move it over to the other side.
Oh, I've got dual monitors. Let me. Sorry, I didn't test my dual monitors there in advance. I apologize. So that's not doing it for you, huh?
Not yet.
All right. Sorry about that. You don't have the PowerPoint loaded up there as backup, do you?
Drew, Drew has it. Do you have it, Drew?
Yes, I do. Give me a minute here.
Sorry, Drew, I didn't know about the dual monitors.
Okay. Yeah, we'll get it. I got it pulled up here, so just let me share my screen. We'll give this a go.
And I can start with, kind of giving folks an overview of the presentation. Thank you very much for the introduction. I kind of come to this presentation today amidst a wonderful, set of presentations you have on some technical issues, and Drew had asked me to share some of my experience over the last decade, because we're all kind of looking at, where are we here 10 years plus out of the beginning of the shale industry here in the Appalachian Basin. And, is in my role in getting the Marcellus Shale Coalition up and running in that late 2009, it's really was a great time to have some of that context and to to share that with you today. I first learned about the Gas Processors Association. One of our executive committee members, John Mollenkoff, was very involved with GPA at the national level. I think he was on the board, and I remember learning about GPA, and great to see that you are hosting this conference here, almost 10 years after getting started here in the basin. So Drew, do we have the PowerPoint up yet?
Yes. Can you see it okay?
Drew, I'm not seeing it for some reason.
What's that?
I don't see it. There we go. It's coming.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, wonderful. So if you could go to the next slide, what I'm going to
Sure.
talk about is really getting some perspective by looking back on that 10 years. If we were in a room together, I'd be able to do a show of hands of how many of those of you, were around in 2010 working on Marcellus, Utica, and related pipeline issues. It's surprisingly low in the last few years, and I think that's why it's very important to kind of do this little bit of history. So those of us working now in the basin, can speak to how things were developed and why, and I think that helps us be better stewards of the industry overall. I'd like to give you some examples of how we earned that license to operate in those early years. You couldn't say as much if you were operating in Maryland or in New York State. As we know, those states are shut down to upstream development and have not made it easy for the pipeline activities. But what were some of the things we did? What do I think really worked, and where do we still have some room for improvement? And then, I'll spend a little bit of time about where the industry stands today, although those of you on the call are certainly experts at that, and save some time to talk about kind of what are the levers that I believe are really going to, set us for the next 10 years. And as I promised to Drew, I love the Q&A. It's the best part of a presentation. So I'm certainly, willing to save time and answer any and all questions that you may want to put forth. So next slide, please, Drew. So, let's go over kind of the state of the industry 10 years ago at the highest level. The knowledge level of the average elected official or, even supplier to the industry was very low. I'll never forget when, I first learned how to spell Marcellus in like 2005, and I was an early adopter. So, I think that when we look back at how little was understood, it was a big mystery. And, if you started to get into, horizontal drilling and high volume hydraulic fracturing, people's eyes glazed over and you had to start way back. But there were a lot of things that the industry and its supply chain did early on to increase that knowledge level. Very strong partnerships with Penn State and other institutions that recognized that they could be honest brokers of information. At the Marcellus Shale Coalition, we did a speakers bureau, and back then, you were probably, or we and our members who had been, volunteering and kind of trained to do these presentations, there were probably a dozen a day, and I'm not exaggerating. We had a pretty sophisticated way of responding to those requests for speakers, and we figured that, by traveling this large commonwealth, and sharing honest information, that was going to be a good foundation on which to build the industry. The jobs also were an amazing foundation. We hired Penn State University's economic research folks every year to do a study, and every time the jobs numbers would come out, we would have some groups that would accuse us of overinflating. And then, of course, the next year, the government jobs would come out and they had exceeded the jobs that we said were going to happen. So very important. The timing was also important coming out of the 2008 recession. You had essentially a buyer's market for for talent, and the talent that was around the professionals in the oil and gas industry. So the attorneys, the environmental consultants, the government affairs and communications folks, and all those folks who had transferable skills and were willing to be good students of the industry and learn the facts. And it was not a small task to be a good student of the industry, but there were a lot of natives that did come into the industry. It was great to see the boomerangs that came, because for all of those petroleum engineers that may have been educated at West Virginia University or Penn State, or had family back here, were some of the first to raise their hands to be relocated back to the Appalachian Basin. And that was really a strong group of people, to build trust and kind of the local knowledge of the local landscape. The politics, incredibly challenging at the time, although I must say they're even more challenging now. But this is when, Governor Rendell was governor of Pennsylvania. He was a former mayor of Philadelphia, and then Philadelphia wouldn't have known the first thing about oil and gas development. It just wasn't part of their history as it was in some other parts of the state. So Rendell, in his term under his DEP secretary, Katie McGinty, had actually put a short-term moratorium on development because of some of the regulations, specifically to erosion and sedimentation, just weren't up to snuff. And so those got rewritten, lots of drivers to get that done well and fast so we could get back to business. Certainly challenging. The legislature at the time and Pennsylvania's General Assembly is largest full-time legislature in the country. So you had a lot of interested legislators, but they were intrigued with the prospects, not only for those legislators in which the Marcellus was getting developed, which was about 2/3 of the Commonwealth. And remember, there was not a whole lot of interest in the pipeline development at that point. The gathering infrastructure was going on basically in the footprint of where the wells were being developed. But they were intrigued by both the job potential in areas they knew could use those additional jobs, but they were also intrigued by the dollars. And we'll talk a little bit more about the taxes and fees and where we were and where we've come from there. The activity level, as probably many of you on the call here today understand, we were probably 10 years ago just over about 1,000 wells in Pennsylvania. West Virginia and Ohio were just barely getting their unconventional operations up and running. The gas processing, early on there was I don't think any outside of Kentucky, significant gas processing. Many of you on the phone probably have more detailed understanding of that history. And then downstream, there was certainly a lot of promise for the downstream, but Shell's plant wasn't announced until about 2012, I think it was. And natural gas-fired generation, that was still the peaker plants here. So we knew that the demand was going to be important, and even had some committees working on that topic. But, I don't think anybody could have predicted just how much the supply and demand mismatch, has gotten us kind of where we are today with these, very low prices. Taxes and fees. Governor Rendell came out very early talking about, wanting a severance tax, and there was lots of benchmarking done with other states. Arkansas had just themselves put a new severance tax in place. And as you can imagine, with any group, but especially with the board of the Marcellus Shale Coalition, there was not one mind as to whether getting the tax issue behind us and moving on was the right decision, or, fighting a severance tax, was going to be, the way to move forward. Lots of different fees were going on that, the industry didn't get a whole lot of credit for, but we'll fast forward a little bit later on where we are now with the impact fee. But the important thing politically was that Governor Corbett at the time had signed Grover Norquist's pledge to not impose any new taxes. So we had a governor who was generally friendly to the industry, but who would not have seen any kind of a tax in place consistent with his political goals. So it made for the industry being somewhat boxed in, and whether we made it through that successfully or not, I think is up for debate. The trade associations at the time were pretty scattered and by and large serving the conventional industry, and had been doing so for a long time. So you had New York IOGA. There were two trade associations in Pennsylvania, one based in Western PA, one in Harrisburg, serving the conventional industry. Two trade groups down in Charleston that were covering West Virginia. You had the Ohio Oil and Gas Association and some other oil and gas education institutions. So it was by no means a one-stop shop. The American Petroleum Institute had a presence here, as well as some other national groups. So really just getting the trade association situation underway, and kind of everyone kind of singing from the same hymnal, if you will, was a challenge in and of itself early on. But a group of companies got together late in the prior decade, ended up in late 2009, putting in place a brand new trade association, the Marcellus Shale Coalition, to just focus on the unconventional activity. The other, I think, important data point about 10 years ago, we knew how important academia was, both from a credibility standpoint. Academia are seen as very unbiased and credible sources of information. However, the challenge was what was going on within the companies, both upstream and midstream, was pretty far along compared to where academia was. So it was not necessarily the interests of the industry to engage academia on research projects or other funding initiatives that were so important to them and still are. There wasn't necessarily a meeting of the mind of that. And so I think that's an area where the interest in partnerships were there, and there were some very unique partnerships that I think served both the academics in their institutions and the industry well. But by and large, that relationship probably wasn't as widespread across the tri-state area as it may have been, or it is down in Texas. And then the NGOs, that could be a whole presentation just in itself as to how those non-governmental organizations, some of which we had very innovative partnerships with that I'll get into in a minute here, but others, I think we were probably a little naive to think about just how much damage they were able to do, especially in some of the last few years. So, Drew, next slide, please. The some really specific examples to give you about how what the ultimate goal was at that point, with my organization and our staff, was really to help the industry earn the license to operate in the basin. As I had mentioned, New York had put in place a policy that essentially delayed a final decision, and was clearly stopping any development of unconventional resources there. We testified down in Annapolis, Maryland, and it was difficult to get the Eastern Shore folks to understand the Western counties, as difficult as it was to get Manhattanites to understand upstate and why this was so important. So we worked on a set of documents that we called recommended practices. And, I really do think that was one of the most fundamental activities we could have done. We all know that there are lots of standards out there, API being one of the, the foremost. However, in one-on-one or in in-person meetings with API, we were told that those practices and standards weren't going to be ready for another few years. And everything was breathing down our neck by the day. So we had to do something. And it wasn't originally for external consumption. It was, you had a lot of new entrants coming in. We had 45 board member companies who were all producers and large, midstream and pipeline operators. And as new entrants came, we didn't, as a group, need them to make the same mistakes that some of the earlier entrants had made. And so how do you do that knowledge transfer within a committee structure and really get the technical people who have responsibilities for certain issues up to speed as quickly as they can? Because those weren't the issues of competitive dynamics. That was the license to operate, and we were only as good as the lowest common denominator, only as good as who had a spill, that morning. So this process was really important. And it was kind of a grounds up through our committee structure, and it covered, a few dozen major topics, and these are still available on the Marcellus Shale Coalition's website. They were in much greater detail, the kind of information that we worked on with the technical groups that eventually was made public. But the benefits to the industry were huge from a technical standpoint, but then it gave us some very unique opportunities for partnership that exist today and should continue to be pursued. So for example, we engaged with some of the conservation groups, the Wild Turkey Federation and Trouts Unlimited and the Elk Foundation, and put in place some site planning, development, and restoration practices that took the best of what they had already put out to their members in terms of what the flora and fauna, really helped their goals for their conservation and recreational purposes. So, that was one of the first ones that we published publicly, and I think it made for these, for very unique partnerships, and it was a vehicle in which to develop trust. Some of the more technical issues, drilling and completions, just had everybody who was coming, to bear on how to make the most of this resource weigh in. And then there were some other issues that were incredibly important to the communities in which we were operating, hence why a motor vehicle safety, was another practice that we worked on, and every one of these were really signed on to by the members of the board because so much of the work and attention had gone into it. And then finally, we used these as some of the only paid media that we did over the course of the 10 years. The full page ads in regional newspapers, the Philadelphia Inquirer, the Patriot News in Harrisburg, and the Tribune Review that was still in print at that time. We did those full page ads, and then the media looked at those ads and actually treated those stories much more favorably than the average treatment. So, I think that was a way of really getting ahead of a curve. If we could go to the next slide, there's a few other issues. I'll just hit on a couple where I think the industry got ahead of the curve, early, and you may not see today all the benefits from it, obviously, but the fact we don't have as many challenges is because this was done, successfully. One of the classic visuals that was just a horrible thing to be up against early on in the Marcellus was that Josh Fox ad where they lit on fire the tap. We've all seen it. And there's no doubt that you could and probably still can light that tap on fire, and many others like it up in the north central part of the state. The problem was not the oil and gas industry, the unconventional industry coming in. The challenge that had been there for a long time was the pre-existing methane in the subsurface, and the fact that Pennsylvania was only one of, I think, 2 or 3, and may still be the only one, states that don't have requirements for casing private water wells. You can imagine the rural legislators did not want to impose those kinds of costs on their constituents, but as a result, you had some very poorly designed and operating private water wells. And in that part of the state, a lot of undisturbed methane that was making its way into taps and had been doing that for decades. But it was certainly a powerful tool to use against the oil and gas industry. So both in voluntarily, but then also codified later in regulations, was the requirement to do pre-drill testing of any private water well to establish a baseline and establish some liability protection for the industry. The benefit for the homeowner was a free test of their water well, although if it was contaminated, that was a little tricky to be the bearer of that bad news. But that's an issue that is still raised here and there. But being able to demonstrate that there was a pre-existing condition certainly, helped us move on from some of those early challenges about the water well accusations. The second bullet there on eliminating waterway discharges, I had worked pretty extensively prior to joining the MSC on the problem we have in the Commonwealth of total dissolved solids in our major waterways. And that had been a longstanding challenge for almost every single waterway of any size in the Commonwealth. So the challenge that the oil and gas industry had is even though the entire problem wouldn't be our fault, we didn't want that issue at our doorstep. And so when you're the last one in, you tend to get blamed, and maybe rightly so. And so what we ended up doing with that issue, and to eliminate the problems of bromides and other potential constituents of concern in the Commonwealth's waterways, because the publicly owned treatment works at the time weren't equipped to deal with this water, we did a board vote. I'll never forget, it was unanimous up in Williamsport at the old Genetti Lycoming, and very exciting to see the industry come together and realize that whereas there may be some near-term logistics challenges, some near-term costs, that by eliminating that pathway into the Commonwealth's waterways, we were taking that issue off the table. Again, probably didn't get as much credit for it as it would have been nice to have, but I think, as Pennsylvanians, we recognize that that was the right thing to do, and the industry certainly saw, that was the right thing to do from both a business and a corporate citizen role. Lots of other items here, chemical disclosure was another one of those important board of directors votes that said, we shall disclose the chemicals used in the hydraulic fracturing process. And that was right at the time that Frac Focus was stood up by a neutral third party. Very important, you still today will hear, the concern about they hide those chemicals. Well, anybody who says that, sit down with them, get on to the Frac Focus website. There's more information there than even, PhD chemists can consume in any reasonable amount of time. So, got ahead of that, said, as an organization that our members are going to, disclose these chemicals. Air quality was a similar issue. DEP was getting a lot of pressure to have the oil and gas industry report its air quality, because heretofore the emissions had been below any important thresholds, and still are in most cases today. But recognize that we needed to come together as an industry and put those numbers out there, not just on a facility by facility basis, but very importantly to start doing air quality monitoring and sharing those results. And many people don't realize that of all that air quality monitoring that's been done in the field at a variety of stations that the state agencies monitor or county agencies monitor, or that were done by academic institutions, not a single one of those public air quality monitoring stations have shown anything exceeding the National Ambient Air Quality Standards, which are the standards that we hold ourselves to at the state and federal level here. So really important work done on air quality, and I credit the midstream and pipeline companies who are our members, who were really very, very ahead on that issue and brought their expertise to bear for better policy outcomes. Throughout all of this, if you could go to the next slide, there were opportunities for, I guess I would call them uncommon and new partnerships. Within the industry, we had to get a level of cooperation that would allow us to weigh in on issues with a single voice, and not kind of divide our opinion across different legislators who would then have no choice but to throw their hands up and do nothing. So around the board table was important. I talked about the Speakers Bureau and other the recommended practices that got the individuals themselves feeling comfortable about which direction we were going on these issues that they would read about in the morning paper. With elected officials, I mean, even today is no different, but there was a lot more noise about it early on. Elected officials are the ones that really are out there in the public, whether it's county commissioners, municipal officials, or the state legislators who were being asked a lot of questions, and we needed to give them answers so they weren't kind of the deer in the headlights, and we needed to give them complete, understandable, and unbiased answers for the questions that their constituents were asking. And I think that for the elected officials who were there then, especially the ones in the regions where we were operating, really appreciated that, to the point that that extra effort gave us raving fans within those groups. As we all know, legislators turn over, and new folks come in, and the industry obviously has to keep up with that education, which is an ongoing challenge that we all have. Special interest groups, local reporters. That was so important to get the local reporter to understand that he or she could call and get the information they needed on deadline. And there really wasn't a small paper that wasn't reporting. 10 years ago, they all weren't online as much as they are now, but very important to get those local reporters collaborated with and seen as part of the solution here. And then across the supply chain, and I think that it's easy for companies who are in the supply chain, many of whom I presume are on the call here today, to say that this is a challenge of the drillers, or this is a challenge of my client's client, and it's really not my problem. But what our theory was, and I believe this very strongly today, is if you're part of that supply chain, you also need to be a student of the industry and be able to provide unbiased and heartfelt feedback. It's so easy at the local block party if someone's saying nasty things about oil and gas, just to kind of go over there and get another beer. But I really do think that the supply chain's ability to help us spread the message, those companies were seen as leaders in their community, and in their local infrastructure, in their chambers, in their economic development organizations. And the more that they felt like their fate was tied to the fate of the industry writ large, the better off we all were. So that continues to this day, maybe just some different forms, but it's I think that's a big part of our license to operate. So going forward, next slide, the current state of the industry, let's look at these same topics we talked about a few minutes ago. You know, the knowledge definitely higher. A lot more people know how to spell Marcellus today. However, I'm not sure that the delivery that we are focusing on, you know, giving more knowledge is keeping up with the new entrants, new elected officials, new citizens, you know, new people who move to this community. You know, there's, you know, kids growing up. What are they hearing? You know, when they maybe, you know, were too young to understand 10 years ago, they're now, you know, hitting middle school and high school and starting to become thought leaders themselves. So, you know, it's a challenge to continue to deliver grassroots education at a time when, you know, all parts of the industry are, you know, not exactly flush with cash. And so I think the ground game, the grassroots education is more important now, you know, than it ever was. And it's a lot more cost effective than, especially during an election year, than ad campaigns that by and large didn't do nearly as much and much less on a per dollar and ROI basis than the kind of education that we delivered at a community level and that the industry, you know, is still doing today in the area in which they operate. I think the jobs, it's been pretty well proven now that, yes, these really are jobs. I think that the challenge, as we all know on this call, that some of these industry jobs don't stay in one place for too long. And so the industry leaders that might have served in certain communities, you know, in you know, high volunteer levels on community boards, you know, we just don't have that at kind of the Pittsburgh or the you know, Charleston or Columbus level. We certainly have that kind of leadership more at the community level. But you know, I think that the jobs are an established part of this. The only problem is, you know, when you see large companies leaving the region, and, you know, Chevron, you know, anybody who is following sees those jobs pulling out, somehow doesn't understand that that acreage, you know, will at some point come with replacement jobs for that. So, you know, anybody looking at just the headlines today who doesn't know much about the industry would probably see the jobs as a negative, but we know there's a lot of them, maybe just a few less right now than there have been, and there will be again. The politics now, I don't need to tell anybody, you know, here about, you know, when you see the ability to hydraulically fracture is, you know, kind of one of the key talking points, and probably will show up in the debates of the presidential campaign. You know, we are right in the thick of it here. And, you know, I think that goes, you know, the whole way down the, you know, the political levels of government, that, you know, it's very important. Parts of our industry have been politicized. However, we have the benefit now, 10 years in, to have developed relationships, true long-term, authentic relationships with some of our elected officials. And there's probably not as much you know, suspicion or let's wait and see as there was then. So, you know, kudos for continuing to invest in some of those political relationships. Activity level, you know, upstream is obviously, you know, slowing on some of the new permits and new drills, but, you know, we've got record production. Gosh, the infrastructure on the midstream that has been, you know, put in place, and the gas processing and the, you know, the long haul pipes that are, you know, that are delivering Marcellus gas to where no one would have thought they would have been delivered. So, you know, I think, again, the activity level, very high. We know that compared to 10 years ago. Shell alone, you know, those many billions of dollars is certainly a high activity level. But we, I think, have to counter the fact that just because the the rate of increase has slowed or, or stalled for a bit here, that doesn't mean it's still not a very important and large industry. Taxes and fees, I think as of this summer, we were at about 1.9 billion in impact fees in Pennsylvania alone that have been captured from the industry to go to a variety of recipients as part of that Act 13 package. So certainly there's been a lot of dollars through that and other payroll taxes, property taxes, corporate taxes. There's we're not hearing as much about that on a day-to-day basis as we were 10 years ago, although as we all know, Governor Wolf continues to want to put a severance tax in place on top of the impact fee, which is really a tax. Trade associations, I think there's been probably more cooperation than ever. However, there's still a variety of challenges in each state and at each type of or aspect of the industry that doesn't necessarily allow everything to be pulling in the same direction. But, I think that's there's been some consolidation, which helps. The dollars available right now, are always going to be a challenge to be able to execute on, some large initiatives at that level. And then academia, I'm not sure we came through and really leveraged the academics, but I think a lot of that is because of the funders of the NGOs and of academic programs. One publicly or a charitable foundation, the Heinz Endowments, that gives here in southwestern Pennsylvania, has given over the last almost 10 years more than $50 million just to anti-oil and gas or anti-natural gas causes. And that goes to academia, it goes to all sorts of other groups. That's huge. And I don't think that's something that we ever believed those dollars were that big and that big relative to what the industry is putting, toward kind of public the public discourse. So, I think the challenge is if we don't keep the education level up, and if these NGOs and their funders, are as emboldened going forward as they've been over the last few years, we may be paying the price for that. But to kind of conclude the looking over the horizon on the next slide, I just picked a few of the issues that I think are really going to make or break, how successful the oil and gas industry can be here in Appalachia. It's a very different foundation than, in the Rocky Mountains or the Southwest, mid-continent, or, up into the Bakken in Canada, because of population, because of proximity to some of the East Coast chattering class, if you will. But, I think starting looking ahead, there's nothing this industry can do that's more important than continuing the safety record. Do we still get knocked for, a problem here or there? Absolutely. And, I think that the industry has enough stakeholders that no one is getting away with that internally. In fact, I think we should be cheerleading, really applauding the amazing safety record. And as activity and gas flow and, well count went up, our safety record got better and better. So we get less credit for that safe operation than if than we get whacked if there's a problem. However, I don't think anybody on this call would argue that that's, probably one of the first things that we all should be thinking about in the morning and keeping our eye on going forward. I think the role and the reputation of regulators could really, be even more critical going forward. So, early in the Marcellus, it was really important that the regulators had the information they needed from the member companies, and that they were in a position where they could be driving, compliance and not look to be either, you know, in the pockets of the industry, which would be horrible. But on the other hand, the industry didn't want them to be so punitive that, that the ability to operate was curtailed. And, you know, I think at some point there was, you know, a pretty good role of those regulators. And in some aspects still are. However, what concerns me and why I put this this issue on here is the recent Attorney General's report chose to degrade the ability and the reputation and the capabilities of the regulators. That's demoralizing to our public servants, but it's also incredibly harmful to the industry to have a denigrated regulator role. Something will fill that gap, and I don't think we'll like what that would be. And again, the foundations, you know, if they're funding kind of this third entity who's looking in on not just the industry, but looking in on the regulators, I think we're giving that unregulated elite in a kind of a say in this industry that's well above their education level on it, their knowledge of the industry, and their, you know, and their rights to do that. So. Really important issue, keep an eye on that. The third one is the continued education. I think I've talked about this sufficiently, that, you know, we just can't let up on that. It's not like just because you and I now understand a lot about this industry that we can stop. That's got to keep up. The foundation fundings of the NGOs, you know, we've discussed how emboldened they are. The local jobs and supply chain. Someone can go on to mute, please. The local jobs in the supply chain, you know, I really believe both with some of the resilience that we're having to build into our supply chains as a result of some of the trade disruptions of the last few years, as well as the need to have additional sources of, even if there's somewhat of a premium, you know, some of the transportation, some of the reliability advantages come to that. I'm involved with a project called Shale Power, and we're going to do our kickoff at Pyoga's November 12th Marcellus to Manufacturing event here at the Carnegie Science Center, which will hopefully be in person. And the purpose of that project, funded by the Appalachian Regional Commission, is to continue to build the supply chain for the shale value chain here in the region. So if anybody on this call is interested in getting on that mailing list or being involved on behalf of your company, we'd really enjoy. We're just getting that multiple year project kicked off here this fall. And then to kind of wrap up my formal comments here, looking over the horizon, nothing is as important as the fundamental economics of natural gas and the NGLs that many of you are moving and processing. You know, I think that you know, this kind of sustained low price, you know, the amazing supply that's surprised even maybe some of the most the most long-term petroleum engineers has really, you know, put us in an enviable position in this basin, but it's also, you know, created some imbalances that have yet to work out. I think the financing and how the next, you know, 6 to 12 months will play out in terms of how Wall Street sees the future of this industry and what projects are going to get favorable financing and what may not be able to do that any longer is going to be very important, and how patient boards of directors and you know, and shareholders are going to be for some of these projects. I think are fundamental. And then the markets, you know, what happens with the overseas markets? How does the Europe, Germany and Russia, you know, square off? What's going on with the developing nations? You know, how do we get out of this COVID-induced downturn? and see some of the Asian economies, back to demanding our LNG and even some of our downstream petrochemical products coming from this region. So it'll continue to be an exciting place, both in the technical and the public policy side. But learning from those lessons from early in the Marcellus, I think this is as good a time as any to remind ourselves, how far we've come. Take a moment to really be self-congratulatory for all of you who have, operated safely every day and who continue to innovate to bring, higher productivity and lower costs to the industry. And let's keep working together for the next decade. So that concludes my formal remarks, but I would, as I said up front, welcome any and all questions, and I'll turn that back over to you, Drew, and our hosts for bringing those questions up.
Okay, thank you, Katie, so much for the presentation there. Lots of great information. Interesting to hear how it all got started up here, because I know personally for myself, I wasn't in the area until late 2013 and came over from the chemical industry. So it was a big change for me at the time, and it was exciting to kind of catch the wave, so to speak. And it's always interesting to hear the different perspective that others have. So Gary, I don't know if you got any questions that were sent in to you on the chat. If not, we can just open it up to the floor.
Yeah, we have one question from Eric Brink. What role does ESG, environmental social governance, play in the natural gas industry, especially in the Northeast?
Well, that's a great question. I by no means have benchmarking of every single, company and what they're doing. But, I really think a lot of those ESG issues are very industry specific. And, just even going through the recommended practices that I did here, companies need to be paying attention to, the fundamentals of that in order to, even continue to operate, to get their permits, to, submit their emissions, to not be, fined or receive NOVs. So, oil and gas is probably a leader, being so far ahead of needing to deal with those issues, whereas I think some other industries maybe don't have as many inherent challenges that they've been working on for so long. But I think a lot of this is a normal distribution. I think some companies have very early leaned into how the ESG reporting can help them, either with their stakeholders or with their own internal performance. The difference here is that the oil and gas industry's molecules don't necessarily differentiate themselves. Each company's in the marketplace, right? So if I have a product and I want to brand that product as an ESG branded, item that's going to go into another product or go straight to the consumer. There's a whole lot that's important about ESG about that. I think from the very beginning, one of the challenges from the oil and gas industry entering this much more high profile role is that they didn't have necessarily a product marketing. Marketing meant, which pipelines is going on, who's buying it, and that's all really, really important and fundamental to the industry. But certainly no packaging, no advertising, no branding of that molecule. And so I think that's why the oil and gas industry, in my opinion, is kind of on a slightly different track. Although the industry overseas is seeing a whole bunch of different things. I've had the privilege to work for the industry in the UK, and I think their regime around these issues, was certainly a few years ahead of where we are here in the US. But the regulatory requirements here are non-trivial, to say the least.
Yeah, I would agree, and it seems like most of the companies, especially in the Northeast, with the stricter permitting requirements and regulatory requirements, they were early adopters of these things, and their values always showed that, but they maybe never called it ES. You know, they were still doing it because they had to, and because permitting and because it was the right thing to do as well. But now it's just become more formalized, charters and such.
Right.
Mhm. That's all in the chat, Drew, that we have. But if anyone has other questions, feel free to unmute yourself and ask verbally if you'd like.
Come on, I love this part.
We got
Yeah,
about
there's got to.
close to 40 people on the line, in addition to me and Drew. So 3 of us.
There's got to be a couple questions out there. Come on, guys.
I guess I'll ask the question regarding the political environment. Not to say I can, asking you what do you foresee happening, but I guess if the Democrats take back the administration, what do you have any insight into what may happen with regard to the industry?
Well, I mean, the regulatory regime and the political regime, as most of you on the call understand, are on kind of two different tracks, right? Takes a while to get new regulations through the process if they're being done according to to the regulatory state and federal regulatory process. So those things don't happen overnight, despite what some of the elected officials will claim that they're doing overnight. And just like some of the streamlining and some of the kind of red tape removal issues that we heard about, in a Trump campaign and early in his administration, really are kind of hitting our respective news feeds, in the last year or so, because those things take time. I think probably rightly so. The real attention that's being given is kind of this writ large, the right to even operate. And, one side of all of our reasoning could say, oh, that's crazy. That's never going to happen, because of course people need, oil and gas and need the products that come from NGLs. Even if a Biden campaign does say that, it's really not going to come to pass. Well, I mean, I guess where I'm a little concerned, again, going back to what I was asked to speak about here today, is, 10 years ago, we could have said that, but at that point, New York State and Maryland were not closed to development, and there were not land, as well as Wayne County, Pennsylvania, way up in the Northeast. There are, it is possible to shut things down, and yes, the consumer will pay more and they'll be kicking and screaming, but they probably won't really understand why. And certainly won't come back, and no one's going to apologize to the oil and gas industry for curtailing operations. So I think at this point, we should be focused on that really big question about, it's kind of an all or nothing. Not that any of us believe nothing will happen overnight, but that death by 1,000 cuts, is something that should keep us up at night. And then I think it emboldens states who then, have to cover their flanks by, putting additional rules in place. The challenge I see is that, both laws and regulations, you get a lot of credit for putting a new one on, more so than you get any credit for enforcing the existing ones. And, so we've all been in situations where we've got duplicative rules at multiple levels of government, as well as covering the same issues, because someone needed to say that they did that. And right now, I think the industry's back on its heels. And it's easy to put some of these new regs on, especially if you don't kind of have that backstop at the federal level that at least isn't making it worse. So, I mean, that's, I'm by no means a political guru, but I think we've seen enough of how these regulations get put in place because no one's strong enough politically to stop them. I'm a huge fan of Senator Gene Yaw here in Pennsylvania, who comes at these things very pragmatically. He's cares very much about the environment, but he's also, looking at the real, how these things are really gonna play out. So hopefully, regardless of what happens at the federal level, we still have folks like that at the state level working on our behalf.
Yeah, a couple more questions. So we got a few minutes here before we can start the next session. Future challenges to the environmental issues as it relate to gas compression.
Well, I mean, I'm not sure. Well, this is my opinion is that the kind of the gas processing industry, which we're here under the banner today, has probably been able to stay more below the public radar screen than maybe any of us would have expected 10 years ago. Although that's not to say there haven't been some really disturbing and somewhat overreaching violations put to some of the industry's operations. And then I'm not an expert on all of PHMSA, but I certainly think we're seeing regulations like that are kind of more working its way, up and down the value chain. So something that we may have thought was only an upstream issue now gets applied to midstream, or something that's only a petrochemical facility issue now, is getting pushed up through the operations to gas processing and compression. So, I think the future challenge at the biggest level is that more is better, and something we thought was limited to one segment can get misappropriated and now be put across multiple aspects of an organization or of an industry. So for example, I've long worked in air quality, and we saw issues related to how you define a major source, and it was pretty clear from EPA precedent what that meant 10 years ago, but I think that's been eroded, and we're seeing a lot of challenges with aggregating multiple sources, even if they're not contiguous, and being subjecting those to a higher level of permitting and therefore offsets of emissions. And the regional greenhouse gas initiative issues that are being fought right now in Pennsylvania and at the Environmental Quality Board, carbon brings on a whole new set of unforeseen regulations that are going to hit compression just like all other aspects. So for those of you who aren't kind of up to speed on the decisions around the regional greenhouse gas initiative, that's a right to your legislature kind of issue right now.
Okay, and then one last question. How do you think that the DAPL, Dakota Access Pipeline ruling to stop production will affect the future pipeline permitting and environmental assessments?
Yeah, well, I mean, when you think about what happened, what was that? When was Keystone XL? I think those issues get everyone. Let me put on my Appalachia hat. I'm not sure it's as big a deal as some of these other things we've already talked about today. If I put on my multinational hat, or certainly any of you, I apologize on the call, who have a stake in the development, that's very much tied to that. But I think what we've seen in terms of gas prices, in terms of when the Permian dropped, the stock value of some of the Marcellus companies went up. I think Chevron probably recognized that their different operations are all competing for the same cash. So we here in Appalachia, if we're being parochial, our advantage is this proximity to market. And, you know, I think kind of those bigger issues are really important to the reputation of the industry and its ability to function. But, you know, I think if we look at in our backyards, literally and figuratively, and keep our own house in order, you know, I think we've got a lot of advantage here. And I'm not sure that what's going on there is going to necessarily, you know, have a direct one-to-one, you know, relationship here. So I'm sorry if that's not a, you know, exactly answering the questioner's question, but that's kind of how I see it right now. It's a big country, lots of, you know, we're always going to have the whack-a-mole challenges, and but I think, you know, Appalachia stands to be strong going forward, assuming we can get out of this sub $1 local gas price.
Right. Well, yeah, that Dabble had Native American land issues as well, right? So
Right. And yeah, and so not only, I mean, there are a number of federal regulatory programs that, you know, are really a challenge in the West that we don't have here. We have some that they don't, like, you know, all of our land is incorporated, and we've got, you know, 3,600 units of local government in this Commonwealth. But yeah, some of those big regulatory programs, you know, just don't apply here.
Mhm. I think that's it for the questions on the chat. So thank you very much for your time today, Katie.
Thank you. Thanks for including me. And again, if anybody wants to talk about supply chain, local supply chain issues, I'd love to hear from them.